Chapter 5, the Integumentary System, Part 1. So the integumentary system, its main components include the skin, which gets broken down into the epidermis and the dermis. The skin is the largest organ of the body, and the hypodermis. The hypodermis is underneath or deep to the skin, and the hypodermis is made up of adipose tissue. Functions of the integumentary system include protection. The skin helps to protect our body from UV radiation, helps to protect from abrasion, from things bumping into us, helps to keep water out, keep chemicals out. Very protective. The skin also helps to regulate body temperature. So, for instance, if we get too hot, our skin will produce sweat. The sweat will evaporate, removing the heat, cooling us down. Excretion. Again, the skin does sweat, so it does get rid of some salts through sweat, some water. Also gets rid of some water actually all the time. Production of vitamin D. It turns out the beginning of the process of making vitamin D in our body starts in the skin, and it is triggered by UV radiation, exposure to UV radiation from the sun. And vitamin D is important because vitamin D helps us absorb calcium from the foods we eat. And finally, the skin is a sensory receptor. The skin is a very sensuous organ, detecting things like touch, tickle, itch, pain, temperature. Epidermis. Epidermis is the superficial layer of the skin. So that is the part of your skin that you can easily touch. The epidermis is made up primarily of 4 cell types, the first one being keratinocytes. So actually, 90+% of the epidermis is made up of keratinocytes. And they are arranged in many, many, many layers, and they are producing keratin. They get their name from the keratin protein they produce, and as the cells migrate toward the surface of the epidermis, they flatten out and fill with keratin protein, which has a nice protective function. Melanocytes. Melanocytes are the cells in our skin that produce skin pigment, which is called melanin. So melanocytes produce the pigment melanin. They then transfer that pigment into keratinocytes. Melanocytes make the pigment and then put it into the keratinocytes. Melanin is important because it helps to protect us from UV radiation, which means it's protecting our cells from exposure to this radiation, making it less likely that we will get skin cancer. So the darker your skin, the less likely you will get skin cancer. Dendritic cells. Dendritic cells are found in the epidermis. The dendritic cells involved in the immune response. So if pathogens happen to breach the epidermis and reach a dendritic cell, that cell will engulf the pathocyte, pull it in through the process of phagocytosis, and then destroy the pathogen. And phagocytosis is a form of endocytosis. And finally, we have the tactile epithelial cells. These tactile epithelial cells act as a touch receptor. They are always adjacent to a sensory neuron. So tactile epithelial cells can tell when something pushes on our epidermis and then transmits that information to the sensory neuron that then carries it to the central nervous system. So what tissue makes up the epidermis? What is that tissue called? You should be able to know all this already. It is stratified squamous epithelium. Or you can go even further and say keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So the epidermis comes in many layers. The deepest layer is called stratum basilae. And stratum basilae lies on a structure called the basement membrane. And then that lies on top of connective tissue. So stratum basilae attached to basement membrane attached to connective tissue. Stratum basilae is a single row of keratinocytes, so only one row. And all new keratinocytes are produced here. So the keratinocytes at stratum basilae are constantly dividing, producing new cells, and pushing those new cells up above stratum basilae. Also found in stratum basilae are the melanocytes. So melanocytes are found in stratum basilae, as well as the tactile epithelial cells. They are also found in stratum basilae. There's three different kinds of cells: the keratinocytes, the melanocytes, and the tactile epithelial cells. And the cells are all alive. Clearly, all the cells are alive in stratum basilae. Then stratum spinosum is superficial to stratum basilae. Stratum spinosum is, who knows, maybe about 10 layers of keratinocytes. It varies a bit. The cells in stratum spinosum are connected to each other by desmosomes. So the cells produce desmosomes, those strong connections between the cells that hold them together so they can resist forces. And this actually makes them look kind of spiny under the light microscope, which is why it's called stratum spinosum for spiny. Also found in stratum spinosum is the dendritic cells. And of course, as we know, dendritic cells help to engulf pathogens. And then finally, the melanocytes place the pigment melanin into the keratinocytes found in stratum spinosum. Above that, we have stratum granulosum. Stratum granulosum is 3-5 layers of cells. They are flattened cells, so the cells are nice and flat now. And at this point, the cells are undergoing apoptosis. That's programmed cell death. The cells in stratum granulosum are producing lots of keratin, filling up the cells, making them tougher, but in the process also killing the cells. And this is a good thing. We want this to happen. Then we have a thin layer called stratum lucidum. Stratum lucidum may be 6 layers of cells thick, and it is clear, flat, dead cells. Stratum lucidum cells are dead. No nucleus, no other organelles. Now, stratum lucidum is only found in thick skin, and thick skin is only found on the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. Finally, the most superficial layer is stratum corneum. Stratum corneum, about 30 layers of flattened dead cells thick. These cells are constantly being shedded. It turns out most of the dust found in houses are coming from the keratinocytes shedded off of the stratum corneum. You can touch your stratum corneum. And the cells are just packets of keratin. No nucleus, no organelles, just keratin. Now, the thickness of stratum corneum can vary. So, for instance, a callus is when you get an extremely thick stratum corneum. And the callus, of course, forms in some place on your skin where the skin is experiencing a lot of friction. So say if you start playing the guitar, you'll develop a callus on your thumb where you keep plucking the guitar strings. Now again, all new cells, all the keratinocytes are produced in the stratum basilae. The new cells are pushed up above the stratum basilae into stratum spinosum. That'll push the cells above it and the cells above it and so on and so forth. So cells over time migrate through the various layers of the epidermis. And while they're migrating through the epidermis, they undergo the process of keratinization and also end up dying. UV radiation. UV radiation comes from sunlight and it can damage our DNA. By damaging the DNA, it leads to mutations. These mutations can lead to things like accelerating the aging of the skin so that it looks older, and also lead to mutations that cause skin cancer. So UV radiation is the main cause of skin cancer. Skin cancer is an uncontrolled growth of epidermal cells. The cells start dividing, and they keep dividing, and they don't stop dividing, and they form structures, and those structures, those tumors, will then invade surrounding tissue and damage that tissue. Skin cancer is the most common type of cancer. And the people most at risk are people with fair skin, with light skin. So the less melanin you produce, the more likely it is you will develop skin cancer, especially in the face and hands areas. To reduce this, the use of sunscreen is highly recommended, and of course avoiding exposure to UV light. Don't get on tanning beds. There are 3 main kinds of skin cancers. There's melanoma. Melanoma, these tumors are dark in color, and they are caused by mutated melanocytes. Melanoma is extremely aggressive, extremely dangerous. This is why they tell us to keep an eye on our moles, because moles are basically little benign tumors which sometimes can become cancerous and dangerous. There's basal cell carcinoma. Basal cell carcinoma means the keratinocytes have mutated on the stratum basilae level and form the tumor. And squamous cell carcinoma is when a keratinocyte in the stratum spinosum layer mutates to form the tumor, the cancer. Basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, these are not that aggressive and relatively easy to treat. So, thick skin, thin skin. Thick skin lacks hair. Thick skin has a very thick layer of stratum corneum. Thick skin possesses stratum lucidum. Thin skin has hair. Thin skin is always has some hair associated with it. The stratum corneum is extremely thin, and there is no stratum lucidum. So where do you find thick skin? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, and everywhere else is thin skin. So most of our skin is thin skin. A blister. A blister is when there's some sort of injury that causes the epidermis to separate from the dermis, and then that space fills with fluid. So what's puffing out, that is the epidermis, then there's fluid, and then there is the dermis. And it can be filled with plasma, blood plasma, or it can be filled with blood itself, giving you a blood blister. And the best thing to do is leave the blister alone. Don't pop it. The dermis. The dermis is deep to the epidermis. The dermis is made of two kinds of tissues primarily, dense irregular connective tissue and areolar connective tissue. The dermis is significantly thicker than the epidermis. It has lots of different kinds of cells in it, including fibroblasts and macrophages. Also houses lots of structures like blood vessels, nerve cells, glands, hair follicles. Lots of things are found embedded in the dermis. The superficial portion of the dermis attaches directly to the epidermis. At the superficial surface between the epidermis and dermis, the dermis has these little finger-like projections that push up into the epidermis. These are called the dermal papillae. This increases the contact between the epidermis and dermis, helping to hold them tightly together because, again, we don't want blisters to form. We don't want them to separate. Also found in the superficial area are these little touch receptors, which, again, are able to sense touch sensation. And the superficial region of the dermis is primarily made of areolar connective tissue. The deeper portion of the dermis is attached to the hypodermis. The deeper portion is larger than the superficial portion and houses the nerves, the hair follicles, the sebaceous glands, aka oil glands, the sweat glands, and the deeper portion of the dermis is primarily made of dense irregular connective tissue. Again, lots of bundles of strong collagen protein fibers going in all kinds of directions to resist the pulling forces that may pull on the skin in any direction. Fingerprints. Fingerprints are found only in thick skin. In the thick skin, the dermal papillae connecting the epidermis to the dermis is extremely large, and because of that, they cause folds in the epidermis. Those folds are the fingerprints. So epidermal ridges are the folds of the epidermis formed by the very large dermal papillae. And the purpose to fingerprints is to increase friction, to allow us to manipulate and hold things much easier. Also, the fingerprints, the epidermal ridges, possess lots of sweat glands. So all these little dots up here are openings for different sweat glands. And also lots and lots of touch receptors. This is why your hands get sweaty when you get nervous, for instance. And our hands are very good for touching things and learning about those things by touching them. All right, and that is it for this part of the lecture.